Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Leibowitz, and I have a very interesting story. Well, at least I found it interesting as to how I got today's guest on. My friend and landlord told me, hey, there's this guy, Keith Knight. You got to get him on your show. I said, okay, I'll look him up. So I look him up, and all that's coming up is this cartoonist. And I'm looking, maybe this guy does some political commentaries. Nothing, just a cartoonist. So I'm telling my friend, hey, what the hell are you talking about? What am I going to do with this guy? I'm not going to have him on to talk about cartoons. So I gave up on the idea. And then one day I'm scrolling through my Facebook feed, and a podcast comes on with Keith Knight. And I said, oh my God, this must be the guy. So I look, and sure enough, he's a Facebook friend of mine. So I reached out to have him on to discuss some politics, economics, culture, current events. And, he agreed to come on. So here he is. Keith, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's difficult because that other Keith Knight is a huge social justice advocate. So I came out with a speech recently, 3 social justice lies: racism, sexism, and homophobia. And now I'm really hoping that separates us in the search engine from here on out.
But maybe he'll be getting some bad publicity amongst his people.
Welcome on the show. Yeah. Yeah, I'm getting him back with all the bad
That'll be
publicity.
awesome. He's going to get excommunicated from the social justice team.
Oh, this is like a Curb episode. I really hope people think he's me now.
Oh, that would be freaking great. I might just push it. I push the narrative. That'd be awesome. All right. So, how long have you been an advocate of capitalism, and what drew you to the free market ideas?
I would say what drew me to the ideas was having a consistent philosophy. It always seemed like an itch in the brain when I would advocate for one thing. Say, I liked the Affordable Care Act. However, there was an aspect of the Affordable Care Act which is referred to as the individual mandate,
Yeah.
which requires people to purchase something that they may or may not want to purchase voluntarily. So when I came across that, I said, I feel like people should be able to voluntarily opt out of things, even if it is in their interest, whatever you think their interest may or may not be. I think people should, eat healthy, exercise, read tons of books on economics and history. But then again, maybe I don't know what's best for other people. Even if I did, I don't own the lives of other people. So in this case, yes, they should be able to opt out of purchasing health insurance. It just took me again and again and again to come across this same dichotomy of people really should put money away for retirement because if you don't, you're screwed. But should people be put in jail by the police and shot if they resist, if they don't chip in for Social Security or state schools or anything else? So eventually, that is what led me from being a progressive to being a libertarian and advocate for capitalism. I think the thing that really kept me, though, that was what initially attracted me when it comes to looking at the examples of how some people in places around the world have gone from abject poverty. We're looking at Singapore, we're looking at the Korean Peninsula, looking at Hong Kong, looking at America, or even Britain. How people could go from dire straits to having a significant standard of living that our ancestors never could have dreamed of, and to find that there's a high correlation between the amount of freedom people have, which allows them to engage in mutually beneficial, voluntary economic interactions. That's really what kept me going, was seeing both the wealth and the morality of capitalism.
It's the examples you gave are especially interesting to me because there's two threads of libertarian thought. There's the utilitarian thread that says that this is going to create the most amount of prosperity for the most amount of people. And then there's the individual rights thread, which says we have to protect the rights of the individual. And the two books that drew me to the freedom philosophy initially were Milton Friedman's Free to Choose and Frederick Bastiat's The Law. And that's the two sort of schools that make they represent those two schools, not as the chief representatives, just as they're indicative of them. In Frederick Bastiat's book, The Law, did for me what you're just talking about. I realized at the time, and this is 25 years ago, but I fancied myself a Republican conservative, but I couldn't square that their advocacy, for instance, for the war on drugs with the arguments that I had got from Bastiat. And so I ultimately had to get rid of that and just become freedom. The purpose of government is to protect rights. People have individual rights, and I have no right to tell them what to do or what not to do, for that matter. So I've heard, and I grant that I haven't listened to every podcast you ever did, but I listened to a few of them. And I heard you say essentially that there's three arguments for capitalism. You mentioned the Auberon Herbert Murray Rothbard self ownership argument. You mentioned the Hans Hermann Hoppe sort of the implications of free debate argument, and you use the internal logical consistency argument. But they can't all be right, right? So what I'm wondering is, what is your moral base? When you say, for instance, that the initiation of force is wrong, and that's why you didn't like the individual mandate. When Keith Knight at the end of the day says, this is where I'm grounded, what is the moral base you come from?
So I will get to moral base in 1 second. Just
Okay.
to be clear with the audience, when I'm advocating capitalism, the definitions I'm using are: communism is the abolition of private property, socialism is the institutionalized aggression against private property, and capitalism is a social system based on the explicit recognition of private property and voluntary contracts between private property owners. So that is what I'm advocating. The reason that's important is because if people associate capitalism with profit seeking or greed or competition, the problem is all of those also apply to a
Sure.
democratic state or even a monarchical state where people still want money. Even when there's a king, that king still wants money. Politicians still want money and are constantly in competition. So that's what I am generally advocating. And I love both the books you mentioned. My favorite chapters in Free to Choose of Milton Friedman's book, Free to Choose, are who protects the workers and who protects the consumers. Great arguments in favor of freedom in that book. My moral foundation would simply be, at some point, you just have to pick what you would call an axiomatic claim. And for me, that is, with regard to others, people have a better claim to their time, their life, and any property they acquire through homesteading or voluntary exchange. So when I say rape is unjustified, I'm saying that is a violation of someone's self ownership. When I'm saying enslavement is justified, I'm saying it's one person claiming saying that they have a higher claim to the body, time, property, and money of other human beings. I'm using that as my initial justification, that human beings, with regards to others, have the better claim to their own body. They have to bear the cost. Their brain waves directly control their actions. Other people can only indirectly control them by first controlling things in their own body. So self ownership is the foundation for my belief.
Okay. So essentially the Rothbard position, right? Rothbard argues for what he called the non aggression axiom. But an axiom is a self evident truth. If it was a self evident truth that people ought not to initiate force against others, then it seems to me it would be far more accepted because it's widely disputed. Virtually no, I mean, not nobody, I shouldn't say that, but I happen to agree with the position that the initiation of force is evil and that people have individual rights, but I can't say it's axiomatic. Like the founders, for instance, in the Declaration of Independence said it's a self-evident truth. But if it's self-evident, then why is it so rare? The vast majority of people out there would disagree with you and me. If I say or you say taxation is theft or taxation is robbery, they think it's just par for the course. So how could that possibly be self-evident or axiomatic?
Well, because it is very widely accepted in the vast majority of the aspects of our life that we're constantly dealing with. If I ever ask someone, well, if you're okay with people having intercourse, to adults, well, then what's wrong with raping someone? Well, they will immediately use the philosophy of consent. If I say, well, you say it's okay to work, but then you say it's wrong for me to enslave someone, what's the difference? In both cases, they're working, people are performing labor, and then immediately people bring in the importance of consent and mutually beneficial voluntary exchanges. So in so many aspects of our life, we see that this principle is rather axiomatic and often needs no further justification. But when it comes to the state, people all of a sudden have this completely moral double standard that is, I just think, completely unjustifiable. So I disagree with you that it isn't widely accepted. I believe it is widely accepted. There's just one area of the world where people have yet to apply it consistently.
So what you're saying then is that they know it, they just don't apply it to government for some reason. But it's not just taxation in regard to government. There's all types of laws that people are okay with, right?
Sure.
That have nothing to do with that. And also, I mean, there's criminals that use force against other people. I mean, I spent 25 years in prison for using force against other people. It certainly wasn't self-evident to me that using force was wrong.
Yeah, so if your claim is that the majority of people didn't recognize it as legitimate, I'm just saying the absolute vast majority of
Okay.
people, when it
Okay.
comes to those individuals that themselves, they will often say, "Well, I didn't agree to this," or "I didn't consent to this." People constantly use it. In I bet 99% of your transactions were still based on consent. The biggest, I bet Ted Bundy 99% of the
Sure.
time, for the sake of efficiency, was engaging with people in voluntary ways.
Oh, certainly I did, no doubt about that. I'm just saying that if somebody asked me, is it okay for you to use force against other people to get what you want? I thought it was fine for me to use force. I, of course, didn't like it if people used force against me, but that's a different story. My only point here is that, well, you said that when it comes to government, people don't recognize the principle. And there's certainly people that don't recognize the principle. That's why I have a hard time with its self-evidency. Plus, I think the non-aggression principle is derivative from higher ethics. Rothbard himself ultimately got the principle from Ayn Rand. And Ayn Rand didn't hold the non-initiation of force as axiomatic. She held it as it was derivative from her larger ethical theory.
Yes, but in her interview with Phil Donahue, she explicitly summarizes her philosophy as saying, "I'm against the initiation of force." She says
Absolutely.
either that or in
Oh,
general.
no doubt
Um,
about that. Listen, you're not going to get, I'm not saying the initiation of force is okay. What I'm saying is it's just that the idea that the non-aggression principle is axiomatic is what I'm differing with. I'm
Well, and maybe that's maybe that is the case, and maybe it's not, but I still think it's completely justified. I know Rothbard refers to it as the non-aggression axiom,
Yes.
but I think what he's looking for is just a starting place where
Okay.
people can at least come to at least some sort of agreement, as opposed to, well, the law says, well, because people have so many different sources of law, that at any point two human beings are at least engaging in acts of self ownership at any place and any time throughout history. That's why it is a superior starting point to others.
Oh,
But I know Rand had great takes on this as well.
but no, I just want to make it clear. I don't want you to think I'm all for not initiation of force and it being banned from from human relationships. It's completely unjustified. I was just differing as to the axiomatic nature of it. Now you
I
mentioned
get it.
now you mentioned self ownership, right? And this is where Rothbard starts with self ownership. Ownership applies to property, right? So if you own something, it means you have a right to it, or so you have a right to property. But I don't the right to property is not a primary. It's derivative of the right to life. If you How do you start with ownership and then get the right to life from self-ownership rather than the reverse where you get property rights including self-ownership in my view, but the right to life comes first?
When he's talking about ownership, he's saying a person's right to exclude necessarily. So
Okay.
when you're talking about yourself or your own body, what he's meaning is you own your own body because with regard to others, you have a better claim to it. So that's why self ownership is a superior starting point than starting with property. Because in order to own property, people first have to own their own bodies.
But would you say that self-ownership precedes the idea of the right to life? That's what I'm saying. Because let me just give you a quick summation of my view. My right to life ultimately stems from the fact that I'm an ethical being. I have to act in order to achieve my values. my life is my standard of value. Ultimately, I have to have the right to that which makes morality possible. I have to have the right to defend that from others in order to be able to do what I need to do in this world. So that from that, I say, because I have a right to my life, I have a right to those actions necessary to sustain it. That gives me the right to the exclusion that you're talking about. So would you disagree with that formulation?
So I have a right to life. And then the implication is I have the right to sustain it. Yes, but would that necessarily, wouldn't that possibly create a positive right or positive obligation onto others if
No.
I could only sustain my life by confiscating the labor of others?
No, because, well, first of all, I would disagree with that possibility that I could only sustain my life. Now we're talking about obviously these concepts, they come really into play. Not that they never existed, but they come into play once you have some sense of civilization, right? When you've got a bunch of just absolute warring tribes, or Cro-Magnon man, or whatever man came before, Homo erectus, I don't know, but I wouldn't say. I mean, they're just living savagely. So these concepts basically come into play once you start dealing with human beings, once we start interacting with one another. Then I think people have the right to self-defense, and to say that I have the right to take what they want, I mean, to take what I want from them, would be a contradiction, because I'm saying I have a right to defend myself, but they don't have a right to do the same. Or I have a right to my property, they don't have a right to theirs. I have a right to my labor, they don't have a right to theirs, would be contradictory.
But as far as the first savages who wanted to create civilization,
Yes.
wouldn't they also have the right to sustain
Oh,
their life
yeah,
and
no, no,
start
no. I'm not saying that.
excluding others?
I'm not saying that they didn't have rights. I'm just saying that they're not interacting at a level where these ideas would even come into play. They're basically attacking one another. You come across a different tribe, you immediately go to war. I'm saying it's probably a bad example on my part, to be honest, to go down that road. What I'm really trying to convey is the idea that if I have a right to something, then I can't claim it's solely the right of Michael Leibowitz, right? If by virtue of my existence as a human being, I have a right to maintain my life, to defend my life, to take the actions necessary, including acquiring property, then I can't deny you the same right. It would be a contradiction in terms to say that.
Okay, I will happily concede that.
Okay, so basically we're on the same page so far, by and large, right? We might differ on the terminology, whatever, but we both agree that physical force is not appropriate for human relationships, right? Nobody has the right to use force against other people. People have the right to do whatever they want to satisfy their needs, wants, desires, as long as they don't deny others the right to do the same, right?
Yes.
Okay, would you define yourself as an anarchist or an anarcho-capitalist?
Anarcho-capitalist, I
Uh,
think, is synonymous with voluntarist and libertarian. This is basically just anyone who would believe what we've said thus far:
yes,
self ownership, right to acquire property, right to contract, and no double standard for any organization, even
yes.
if they first put on camouflage, call themselves a military or a Congress.
Okay, so can you define what exactly you mean by anarcho-capitalism?
I mean, any society that has a consistent application where the private property is recognized, the right of self ownership is recognized consistently, and there are not double standards in the realm of morality. So, no one would have the right to collect funds coercively, claim a monopoly right on property that they didn't acquire through homesteading or voluntary exchange, which necessarily rules out the existence of a state.
Why? And the reason I say
Because
that is because you said that you used the word coercion, right? Why does government necessarily have to be coercive? In other words,
uh,
why couldn't you have a government that was funded through voluntary contributions? Maybe they have a lottery. There's Rothbard talked about maybe having inmates work, have to produce labor in order to pay for their own incarceration. So why couldn't you have a government that did that and it would still be a government.
Well, I guess in that aspect, I should be more specific. I'm talking about a state would not be legitimate. So you still could have, if government is a group of people that generally enforces rules or sets standards for society in general, nothing in the anarcho-capitalist philosophy contradicts anything like that. What it would exclude is something like a state, where one group has a right to unilaterally impose obligations and rules on others in a way no other organization would have the right to do to it. So I guess I shouldn't have conflated government and state.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. Now, Roy Childs argued, uh, and David Friedman has made the same argument in regards to objectivism, that it implies anarchy. And their argument is essentially that given that government is voluntarily funded and the initiation of force is barred, that government would have no right to stop somebody else from similarly forming a government in the same geographic area. That's, I don't know if you're familiar with the argument. That's why I repeated it for the audience as well. I disagree with that, and I'm going to tell you why. Because I think that when the risk is high enough, you can of an initiation of force taking place, you can bar the conduct. For instance, I don't see any problem with drunk driving laws, because the chance is so high that somebody driving while they're intoxicated is going to cause physical harm to somebody else. It's a very high thing. There's other things like firing a gun off in the air, and you're not necessarily aiming at anybody. You're just shooting indiscriminately. I would say that you could use force against that person because the risk is so high that they're going to hit somebody. Now, with that said, I don't see how you would evade the initiation of force taking place in an anarcho-capitalist society where you have competing governments over the same geographical area. And I'll give you 3 examples. First, consent, age of consent to have sexual intercourse. Suppose one kid, he's 18, and his protective agency says the age of consent is 16. He dates a girl. Her father subscribes to a defense agency that says the age of consent is 18. It's the same geographic area. They have sex. The father of the girl goes to his defensive agency and says, you have to arrest this kid. He had sex with my daughter. But his agency says, oh, no, you don't. We're here to protect him. That's one issue I don't know how you'd resolve. Another one. Suppose one defense agency, the people that have hired this, think that drugs should be outlawed in the area in which they live. The other says, no, you should not outlaw drugs. Drugs are free use. My defense agency says I can. This defense agency says I can't. I'm in that geographic area. They arrest me. The third one is this. 2 guys are walking. They end up in a fist fight, right? They each claim self-defense. One guy says, well, we're going to go to my court system. The other guy says, hell no, we're going to go to my court system. In any of those 3 cases, you're going to end up with somebody initiating force against someone because they can't agree on the basic law. In order to have a free society, you need to know the rules ahead of time. You have to know, this is what I can do. This is what I can't do. And in an anarcho-capitalist society, you can't know those things.
All right. As far as knowing the rules, it is difficult to know rules because even people can read the same thing and have very different interpretations of it. For
Sure.
example, 9 Ivy League trained Supreme Court justices don't agree on the interpretation of the First Amendment, the Second Amendment,
True.
states' rights, gun rights, abortion, etc.
Yes.
So it's a fool's errand to say everyone will agree. I'm conceding that in anarcho-capitalism, not everyone will agree to everything. But the problem is that even under statism, people do not agree in the Supreme Court case that I just gave. If anyone should be able to agree and come to an idea of what means what, it should be those justices, and yet they don't even agree. The Ketanji Brown Jackson says it's wrong to discriminate. Also, discrimination should be mandatory in favor of one demographic. So we see this all the time. That is my answer on people need to know the
Okay,
rules.
can I address what you just said real quick?
No, because you threw 5 things
Okay,
at
no,
me.
no, you're right. You're right. You're right. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead. You're right. I
Okay, so
threw
when
too
it
much.
comes to if I say that I am an abolitionist, I am against slavery. When some people own other people, I
Yeah.
think that is inherently unjustified. So I am categorizing myself as an abolitionist. That doesn't mean that under a society of abolitionism, no one will ever kidnap anyone and force them to perform
No.
labor against their will. It's that person saying, what I favor is for people to change their default from recognizing slavery is legitimate to saying that slavery is illegitimate. So it doesn't mean that no one ever will. It means we will drastically decrease the likelihood of such a bad thing happening because you've changed how people view the world. When it comes to the example of, okay, so when someone poses such a high degree of risk, for, you use the gun example, you use the drunk driving example. I
Sure.
certainly agree with those. There are some cases where someone is such a potential risk to others that you would have that you would be justified in restraining them.
Yeah.
So we can both have that goal, but just because we have that same goal doesn't mean we agree on the same process. So
Hmm.
when it comes to what process, if we have this same goal, what process should be used to determine the best way to achieve that goal? A coercively funded monopoly, or even if it's just a voluntarily funded monopoly, or voluntarily funded competing agencies. I think that voluntarily funded competing agencies have much more of an incentive to keep their reputation in check when it comes to settling disputes peacefully at low cost, making sure that you have a just outcome, because this allows consumers and the population at large to disassociate with bad actors. That is one of the things anarcho-capitalism has that statism does not, the freedom to disassociate with bad actors. Whereas if you're under a monopolist, you don't have that recognized right. When you say that we could have two people getting into a fight and they don't know which agency to go to because one wants his own agency, the
Yeah.
other wants his own. What would happen is companies would come together beforehand, most likely, and say, here is how we would settle these disputes among our customers. This is not fantasy land. We see it all the time when it comes to car insurance. I have Allstate, you have the General. We get into a crash, our insurance is able to settle it out without exchanging nukes. When it comes to what we're doing now, I have a Shure microphone, which is made from a different company, but they have
Hmm.
an incentive to cooperate with Apple products, and they have an incentive to cooperate with CenturyLink Internet, and they have an incentive to cooperate with the Google company who's providing us with Chrome, who has an incentive to cooperate with the Zoom company. All these companies are voluntarily cooperating. So we could have something that I'm using for free. I don't know if you have the account, but at low cost, they're able to provide this for consumers. So we have
Hmm.
every single reason to believe that companies would come together, because when you have to bear the cost of violence, you're much less likely to engage in it.
Hmm. Okay.
Did that answer um, basically? Oh, okay. The age of consent issue. Yes, this happens. It also happens when it comes to governments. There's governments all across the world. Some say that there's some African nations where 12 is the age of consent. There's others where it's
Sure.
19. Having a government doesn't mean there is necessarily going to be one universal specific age.
No.
Even if they did come up with one age, who knows what's right. So
No.
again, if the goal is to make sure children aren't being sexually manipulated, the best process is for there to be competition in achieving that goal rather than having a monopolist determine what that age should be.
No, no, no. My point wasn't that it would get rid of the conduct or that you would have one rule throughout the world. My point was that in one geographic area, the people would know the rule. In the case where you have competing governments, there's no way to know. You're going by your agency, she's going by hers, or her father's going by hers. That's what creates the conflict. Now, you mentioned the Supreme Court. Now, they disagree that that's true, but they're also the final arbiter, and people generally accept that they're the final arbiter. In the case of competing governments, even Rothbard conceded that you're going to have one agency that's going to be the final arbiter. Otherwise, you just can't resolve the disputes. That to me is government, regardless of what you call it. Now, the other thing is this: is that the Supreme Court, I think you're going to agree with me, is a disaster, right? They come up with methods of interpretation that are going to, further their own personal causes, their personal viewpoints. They're not actually interpreting the Constitution as written. They're reading into it their own agenda. In either, I guess you would call it a minarchist society, in which I'm advocating, or an anarchist society, whatever it was going to be, you would have to have such a change in societal opinion, in the philosophy held by the majority of people in the society, that you would largely do away with that problem. I think well, maybe not in the anarchist society, because you're going to have different viewpoints, but people would have to generally have a change in philosophy, right? Like you're not going to, like, we're not going to implement my society now or your society now. It's just not going to happen today because too many people have different viewpoints.
Yeah, I don't know if it's people need to necessarily believe something extra or whether they just need to stop believing in something that is completely irrational, which is this double standard for the state, which so many people have. I know a lot of minds believed in a lot of gods for a very long time, and eventually people just stopped having that belief. Some people were persuaded. Other ideas just did not survive the evolution of ideological processes that change. But really, when it comes to anytime there is something new, so for example, the Canadian Parliament gave a standing ovation to a guy who was a World War II veteran. Turns out he was fighting on behalf of
Yeah,
the Third
he was a
Reich.
Nazi.
They all
Yeah,
apologized. 2 days later, the Canadian government came out and said, from now on, we're going to try to make sure that all content creators are registered with the government of Canada. And a ton of people who are progressives came out and said, this is absolutely irrational. This is totally tyrannical. I can't believe you're trying to control people's speech. Now, these are people who advocate regulation of the economy and
sure.
every other
Yeah.
aspect of their life. People like Jimmy Dore, people like Max Blumenthal constantly advocate for regulation. But when it's in a new area, then they advocate total freedom. They basically advocate anarchist the amounts of freedom. They say, well, initiating violence or even, significant threats thereof, which are plausible, those should be stopped. Everything else, people should be free to say, free to hear, free to consume, and free to exchange ideas, so long as you're not initiating aggression. So when you have such a dichotomy in people's beliefs, the question is, where do their hearts truly lie? I think their hearts truly lie in the case of freedom, whereas the reason that they advocate things like regulation is just because it's been repeated so many times by so many authorities. That is what's taken as axiomatic, unfortunately. So I don't think it's too unrealistic for people to drop this double standard specifically.
Well, right now, I don't think they will. I think it can happen, but that's what I was talking about. When I said a change in philosophy, I meant a change in philosophy surrounding the idea that you have the right to initiate force against other people. Now, I want to just backtrack a little to the reason I brought up the risk principle, right? The risk principle I brought up because of this. Suppose we start a government, right? And the government, all it's doing is protecting rights. It's not using coercion. It's not forcibly taxing people. It's just protecting rights. Now, suppose 3, 4 people come up and they say, no, we don't want to belong to your government. We want to live in this geographic area. We don't want to belong to that government. I say it doesn't matter what you say. What matters is if you put your hands on anybody or you try to rob anybody or use force against anybody in our jurisdiction, we're going to arrest you whether you consent or not. It doesn't matter. You violated rights. If those people then try to set up a protective agency that they believe is on par with the existing government, the risk of that government allowing them to do so is so high. In my view, it would justify preventing them. I say that because I'm arguing against Roy Childs and David Friedman.
So the existence of a state which would protect the rights of those who violate the rights of others is so likely to arise that you're justified in forcibly stopping it from coming into existence.
Yes, as long as that government that I'm talking about is only protecting rights. If it's confiscating wealth, if it's telling people what they can and can't put in their bodies, who they can and can't have sex with, I'm talking about adults. That's a different story. I'm talking about a just government. And I understand this is a hypothetical because there's never been such a government, but there's never been a running anarcho-capitalist system either. Both of us are in that position. We both have to convince people of our position. So I'm saying if you did have a government that was limited to protecting rights and had no coercion involved, it would be justified in preventing other protective agencies from coming into existence, because the risk would be so high of leading to armed conflict or some sort of initiation of force going on.
I think it would be significantly less likely to lead to armed conflict. So when you have a state which has a monopoly right, they're less likely to bear a direct cost for initiating violence. So this flies in the face of like 1,000 years of economics and the law of demand, where if people have to bear the cost of violence instead of being able to tax it off or claim a monopoly right on a certain area,
Sure.
well, so I just think it's less likely
But they would
to
have to bear the
occur.
cost. They would, because they're not violating rights. It's generally accepted that this government that I'm talking about is there to protect rights. The citizenry, that's what the citizenry wants, is a government that protects rights. They're not forcibly confiscating anybody's money. If they then use force against anybody, they're going to be voted out of office or perhaps rebelled against, because we're talking about a society in which the initiation of force has come to be understood to include things like taxation, drug laws, immigration laws.
Okay. Well, then stopping certain governments and certain instances who are trying to protect rights violators, to protect the Jeffrey Epsteins of the world, well, then, yeah, forcibly stopping them. But I don't think you'd be justified in just stopping anyone because the potential of conflict in the future, after all the history of government engaging in mass violent conflict, if anything, this alleged rights protector should have its guns confiscated because they're more likely to go to war than any other organization. So yeah, if all they're doing is protecting rights, that would be a legitimate government as opposed to a state, which
Okay.
necessarily means a moral double standard. So
Well, yeah.
that I would concede
Well,
is
that's
legitimate,
Albert J. Nock made that distinction as well, between government and state. So,
and I should do that more often.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to point out, for the sake of the discussion, a lot of the people that you've cited, and I wrote them down: Frederick Bastiat, Henry Hazlitt, Jerome Brook, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, Thomas Sowell, Walter Williams, Stephen Moore. None of them were anarchists. Not one.
No.
No.
I'm sorry. I'd have to go into that.
Henry
So
Hazlitt actually called Murray Rothbard. He thought he was a brilliant economist, as do I. When it came to politics, Henry Hazlitt said that Murray Rothbard is an eccentric dolt, was what Henry Hazlitt said. And
well,
Mises, of course, scorned the whole idea of individual rights, and I think he was wrong about that.
yeah, you know what? I'd have to go through
Okay.
Bastiat's work. Look, all of them are wrong.
Okay.
It really doesn't matter. So Mises at one
Okay.
point said those who oppose conscription are the enemies of freedom, and conscription is wrong. It's slavery.
I agree
Henry
he was wrong
Hazlitt.
about that.
I haven't read his specifics, but if you take his principle that the economist is someone who understands not just the short-term consequences of a policy on one group, but the long-term consequences on many other groups, I think he would also come to the anarchic conclusion. Sometimes these great ideas are just not out there. Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle probably all justified slavery. They were all brilliant
Sure, they
and they were
did.
all wrong on this issue.
They
Doesn't
were.
mean we can't still really appreciate all their contributions.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay, now for Israel. Now, let me just give you a little of my own background. I was the spokesperson for the Libertarian Party of Connecticut. I've called myself a libertarian for 24, 25 years. I've stopped doing that. Two things happened. The reason I quit my post as the spokesperson for the Libertarian Party of Connecticut, the Alabama Mises Caucus posted a meme, a picture of the picture they used to post when they were looking for the Unabomber. They then quoted Ted Kaczynski in a positive fashion, then referred to him as Uncle Ted. I want nothing to do with a party that's going to put something like that up. The next thing, I still call myself a libertarian. What stopped me was the post I've seen over the last week of libertarians drawing a moral equivalence between Israel and Hamas. I find absolutely reprehensible. What do you think about that issue? Or should I just put it this way? Do you think there's a moral equivalence between Israel and Hamas?
So in one case, we are taking Hamas, a terrorist organization, and then we're taking Israel, a country which includes both the IDF and civilians. So no, there is not a moral equivalence between
Okay.
Israel and Hamas. As far as the meme is concerned, I think it's sickening to refer to that serial killer as Uncle Anything.
I do
However,
too.
if we hold this principle consistently, that means we basically can't pal around with many of the Democrats who, like FDR, who called Joseph Stalin Uncle Joe
Uncle Joe.
on
Sure.
numerous occasions, both at Tehran,
Sure.
Yalta. We had Truman shaking hands with him, even after the Holodomor. Crimes worse than what Putin has done in Ukraine, although what Putin has done is absolutely terrible. So that one meme, very distasteful. But gosh, it is difficult to find people to ally with these things.
I'm with you. You won't
Um,
get an argument from me. The reason I
All right,
call
so yeah,
I,
Kaczynski's a serial killer. I still thought his writing was very. He really wrote like an economist as far as understanding the long-term effects of policies, not just the short-term, not just on the people benefiting, but on people who have to bear indirect costs later in the future. So I think there's great things to read from Kaczynski, but screw him. I have no problem with him being dead, and the fact that he
I'm
didn't
with
like
you.
the Industrial Revolution, which has given more longevity to more people and higher
Right.
standards
He's
of living than
essentially a
anything
Luddite, right? He was a
could
Luddite.
ever dream. Exactly. Yes, he was the greatest intellectual luddite that I've ever come across. But all right, screw Kaczynski, screw those people who put up the meme and are idolizing him, and screw anyone who is justifying the atrocities of Hamas as well.
All right, fair enough. We'd have nothing to argue about. All right, so let me ask you this: where do you go from here? You're a podcaster. You're obviously a bright guy. How old are you? Under 30?
27.
27 years old. You're a young guy. What's your future look like in the liberty movement?
In about a couple weeks, I will have a new book, which is going to be titled Domestic Imperialism: 9 Reasons I Left Progressivism. I think progressivism is the most dangerous worldview out there. It's especially dangerous because people are much like exposing a fish to water. People don't know that they're actually in it, but they have so many of the progressive assumptions. The state has the right to regulate. All disparities are the result of discrimination. Antitrust laws are legitimate. Tariffs are legitimate. The Social Security is legitimate. State control of education and compulsory attendance laws are legitimate. So, because it's such a widely accepted worldview that people don't even know it's a worldview that there are a great number of arguments against, I wanted to give 9 reasons why I opposed the ideas of progressivism. And it's most attractive among people in my demographic. Alexandria Ocasio Cortez, Bernie Sanders are widely appreciated today.
Yeah.
Even people like Barack Obama are widely appreciated. And Barack Obama ran on a very progressive platform of
Yes, he did.
going after the banks and all this other stuff. And healthcare is a right, but he's going to concede and only give us a public option. But that didn't go through. So progressivism is so dangerous, and the assumptions are so widely um, embraced by people. I thought it was important to write a book about it. So, very often, it's not that all of these issues are so difficult to understand. What happens is people are generally looking for a team to be on for either, some sense of community or some sense of social status. And once they do that, they look for heroes to appreciate and other groups or individuals to vilify. Um, so when you have the divide of who to vilify and who to appreciate based on race, which progressives do, based on gender, which progressives do, they also divide people based on class, the rich versus the poor. But I think that's just as terrible as saying, well, Black Americans are wealthier than Black Haitians. So I guess that group should be against that group. I think it's completely counterproductive. What we want to offer is a new divide: people in their life who achieve their ends in life voluntarily versus those who do so violently. That is a principled replacement for the current fake divides that progressives give us.
Nice summation. So you were born in 96.
Correct.
You were one when I went to prison.
Oh yeah. What would you go for?
I went to jail for a awful lot of crimes. The final crime, the one that led me in for the most time, was I broke up with my girlfriend. She had a new boyfriend. I got jealous and I had him badly assaulted. And I ended up with a rather long sentence. And in prison, I came across a lot of great ideas that benefited me extremely. So that's a good thing. Prison, well, it wasn't a good thing to go to prison. I'm not
Yeah.
saying that. I'm saying it was a good thing that I was able to come across a lot of really good ideas. All right, Keith, thanks for a great discussion. You've been very respectful, even when we disagree. I think that's a very important thing, and I think it's a lost art in the modern world. So where can people find you?
You know what? But before I let you go, I think I'll ask you for a little advice on the new book.
Okay.
I am looking for specific heroes that people can sort of admire, not people who have done everything perfectly and don't have anything, any baggage at all. Impossible. But as far as new heroes for people to admire, the names that I'm using in the book are people like Henry Ford, drastically decreasing the price of a car, giving mobility to more people at lower income levels than otherwise would have it. Cornelius Vanderbilt, he did the same with shipping and trains. Andrew Carnegie lowered the price of steel, making everything cheaper in the production process, giving more people access to wealth than they could have imagined. People like the Wright brothers are the heroes in this book, and even people like Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos have drastically
Sure.
have you sort of managed people in such a way and engaged in this network of contracts that have allowed products and services to be available to way more people than there otherwise would be. When you think of who your heroes are from, say, a Randian perspective, who comes to mind?
I don't know if it's from a Randian perspective. Are you looking strictly for entrepreneurs?
No, not necessarily,
One
but
of
those are.
my one
I'm so focused in on that I'm
yeah,
like, I think I need some more ideas.
one
So
of
I'd
my
ask you.
all-time heroes is Frederick Douglass.
Mm,
There's a line in his book, The Narrative Life of Frederick Douglass, where he says the slave master put his hands on him, and it was the first time he was going to retaliate. And he said, "I've told you how a man became a slave. Now let me tell you how a slave became a man." It just gives me chills just thinking it's such a powerful thing. This is a guy that virtually taught himself to read by tricking white kids into teaching him. He escaped slavery and became one of the best orators there's ever been. He's saying, no, without struggle there is no progress. Got me through a lot of hard times. For me, somebody like Frederick Douglass or a Booker T. Washington are such powerful figures, is because while I was in prison, prison sucks, but I did it to myself, right? And when I would sit back and think about what men like that suffered through no fault of their own, just because of the color of their skin and what they were able to accomplish, it helped me to not feel sorry for myself and to stay the course, to grow and to become a better human being. So as far as heroes go, and I'd put William Lloyd Garrison in there too. I mean, there's things with William Lloyd Garrison I disagree, Frederick Douglass too, for that matter. But these are people that just had a tremendous amount of courage and really risked their lives, for what they believed in. And I happen to think it was a good cause. So I think you can't go wrong with those guys. Not entrepreneurs, not from the 20th century, but still very, very good men.
that is exactly what I was looking for. Thank you so much. So as far as where people can find me, you can find me at libertarianinstitute.org. What we're trying to do there is create a sort of intellectual safe haven from all the propaganda that the media gives us. Almost everything in the media, we have cherry picked omissions, we have constant sensationalism, and we have people who are just so ignorant on topics that it's inevitable that what you will be getting is propaganda. So at libertarianinstitute.org, we're trying to create a free educational archive where you could go to our search engine, type in anything agricultural subsidies, Winston Churchill, minimum wage, and get what we believe is the freedom position on those issues.
All right.
And you
And,
can get a free PDF of the Voluntarist Handbook while you're there.
and what about your podcast?
The Don't Tread on Anyone podcast. All right. So I'm at, I think, 904 videos. If I wanted to give people one intro into the podcast so they could get an idea of what it's about, I would say check out my speech titled Three Social Justice Lies, Racism, Sexism, and Homophobia. That was about 8 months of research, reading tons of books, including Ibram X. Kendi, Hannah Nicole Jones, Robin DiAngelo, Matthew Desmond, where I try to really understand the social justice point of view, explain why it's so dangerous, and what the viable alternative is.
All right. Awesome. Hey, thanks again for coming on. It's been a great discussion. For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Leibowitz. Remember, let me know what you think. Till next time.